Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where Paul Kelly and I have been talking to Senator Simon Birmingham. We're now talking to Liberal Democrat Senator David Leyonhjelm. Thanks very much for your company.
Thank you.
Let me get your reaction to, I guess, Labor's tax policy announcement yesterday involving housing capital gains tax changes, as well as negative gearing changes. What do you think of it?
Well, they equate to tax increases, which I think is the wrong end of the argument. We should be talking about spending reductions, not increasing taxes. Australians are already pretty highly taxed, and the idea of putting taxes up further without any sort of offset somewhere else, I don't think it's the right discussion to be having. The question of negative gearing is interesting because when you look at it in financial terms, property is just one asset class. You've also got shares and bonds and collectibles and all sorts of things. So the question is, should negative gearing on those also be wiped out or cut back? There's an awful lot of people who borrow to buy shares as well. So I can't see what's different about property.
If we look at what's being proposed, Labor, according to its own figures from the Parliamentary Budget Office, over the next decade is going to be raising about $100 billion in taxation increases and elimination of tax loopholes. This is an enormous amount of revenue. What do you make of this in terms of what it tells us about the Labor Party? Yeah,
well, I think both Labor and the Liberals are tax and spend parties, but $100 billion over 10 years is, well, if you average it out, is $10 billion a year. Our deficit is getting close to $40 billion. It's still not going to fix the problem. We are spending vastly more money than we're bringing in taxation. That's the problem. And there is not scope. Considering Australia is a competitive market, we're competing with other countries for investment and trade and all that sort of thing, there is not scope for jacking up taxes by that much. It's just fiddling around the edges. Neither party wants to address the fundamental problem of spending. Now, Henry Ergus, who writes for The Australian, repeated a joke. He said, in the context of the European Union discussing what needed to be done about Greece, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg said, we all know what we have to do, we should do, we just can't figure out how to do it and stay elected. Now I think that's the dilemma that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party face in Australia.
So what's the way out of it?
Well, bravery and an economic narrative. Malcolm Turnbull said what's missing from Australian political discourse is an economic narrative. The Australian public has to be convinced we've got a problem and that it's everybody's problem. There is no such thing as no losers. Everybody is going to have to take a haircut, and if everybody does take a haircut, it'll be a little haircut. If you want to try and load the haircut onto just some sections of the community, the pain will be pretty profound.
If we look at the government's position, the government is now saying that it wants to finance personal income tax relief, and it's looking at financing this through changes to workplace deductions, negative gearing and super. What's your view of that general framework?
Yes, I mean, our tax system is messy and complicated. It's getting harder and harder for an ordinary wage earner to do their tax without having an accountant to tell them all the ins and outs. So simplifying workplace deductions, reducing the overall tax scales and so forth, those sorts of trade-offs makes logical sense. But unless there's an overall reduction in the burden of taxation, you know, it's just fiddling around the edges, really. That needs to be the task that the government should take on.
I want to move on to Senate reform, if I can. You made some comments during the week. It was this week, I believe, about the ABCC, that you would not support its reintroduction if the government also went down the path of certain Senate reform. Take us through both the logic of pairing those things up as well as what it is that you obviously don't like about Senate reform that could be on the table.
Yeah, there are, I guess, three scenarios that are being talked about. One is a double dissolution with Senate reform. One's a double dissolution without Senate reform. One Senate reform without a double dissolution. So the things that the crossbench and I, including myself, are concerned about would be Senate voting reform that made it impossible for the minor parties to win. That means eliminating group voting tickets. We've put forward an alternative, which is to vote 1 to 6 below the line, similar to what Victoria has for its Legislative Council. We think that's a fair and reasonable compromise for Senate voting reform. But if they wipe out Senate group voting tickets, minor parties will never get re-elected. The only one that'll get back in will be Nick Xenophon. Now, if they do that with a double dissolution, we'll all be gone, but I don't think there's time for a double dissolution. If they do that without a double dissolution, then there will be 7 of us sitting on the crossbench for the next parliament, at least another 3 years, 4 years, and we will be very cranky. We'll know we'll have no future. Our small parties won't be able to win again. You'd need probably 10-12% primary vote to even have a show of getting re-elected under no GVTs. So if we're all sitting there saying, OK, this is going to be the end of our time in Parliament for not only ourselves, which that actually doesn't bother me that much personally, but for my party, I would be very cranky. Why would I want to be obliging and helpful and respect the government's wishes?
Well, let me answer that for you. If it's in the philosophical policy space of what you believe in.
Yes. And what I've said is I have so far not abandoned the good in favour of the perfect, but I could become a perfectionist overnight. I would not lose a vote, I don't think, by, for example, voting against the ABCC bill. It contains some very coercive stuff. Obligations to answer questions, reverse onus of proof, that sort of stuff, very illiberal stuff. Now, I've compromised by saying I'll support it if there's a sunset clause on it, but I wouldn't lose a vote if I said, no, it's too coercive.
What do you think of the prospects of the ABCC bill getting through the Senate anyway?
That's a good question. It only failed by 1 vote previously. I think they've gone backwards since then. The numbers have gone backwards. And I'm a bit annoyed with my some of my crossbench colleagues for being so uncompromising about it. Glenn Lazarus, for example, won't engage with the government. He won't take phone calls, he won't return phone calls, I'm told. He misses meetings or won't accept meetings. Jackie Lambie, I'm not sure, she looks for ways to pursue her agenda by using that as leverage, and she's upped the ante each time. I think there's a problem with the way the government approaches a crossbench, and I've given them a bit of advice on how I think they could get a better result.
What's that advice?
I don't think I better talk about that.
What do you think the problem is then?
Well, when one minister works out how to deal with the crossbench, that information is not shared with the other ministers trying to deal with the crossbench. A good example would be Scott Morrison, for example. When he was in his previous portfolios, he became fairly good at dealing with the crossbench, or at least most of us. And he still stays in touch with me. I mean, he's really is quite good at communication. But when I get another minister coming to see me, they have no idea how to deal with the crossbench.
So can I just ask that? So, for example, Christian Porter, who's often touted as a very good minister, he took over the social services portfolio from Scott Morrison. Does he fall into the category you're talking about, where he doesn't know how to deal with the crossbench? Huge funding area for the government. They're trying to get major reform through.
Christian's a nice guy. I like him. We get on very well. But I've only had 1 meeting with him as a minister. And as far as I could tell, he and Scott haven't compared notes on how to get stuff out of, should I say, the less cooperative members of the crossbench. I think they really do need to have a good think about how they approach the crossbench. Now, just to get back to your question on the ABCC, I think if they pooled their knowledge, they pooled their understanding and changed their negotiating style and some of their negotiating tactics, I think they could get it through. But unless they do that, they won't.
Okay, but there's a dilemma here. There's a contradiction here, isn't there? On the one hand, you're saying that the government needs to improve its negotiating with the crossbenchers. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you're saying people like Glenn Lazarus and Jackie Lambie are extremely difficult to deal with anyway.
They are. Not impossible. At a personal level, I get on fine with them. It's really at the sort of voting and issue-based level. And I think a different approach. There's carrot and stick in everything. I mean, we're all there for something. What's going to work better, a carrot or a stick? And the government hasn't tried a lot of options. I'm suggesting there are plenty of other options.
Okay, but at the moment anyway, you're pretty pessimistic about the government's chances of getting the bill through.
Yes, I am. I don't think it'll even go as close as it did last time if a vote was held today.
Well, that's hopeless because, I mean, the Turnbull government came in and said they were going to make an effort with the Senate. Where the Abbott government had failed, the Turnbull government said it would do better.
Yes, and there is certainly I mean, the new ministers are eager to engage with me, but they're not having any more success with all of the crossbench. And in fairness, also, Malcolm started off well, but then he set off on prime ministerial stuff, conferences overseas and other stuff. I haven't heard from him in a good while now. Not that I'm offended, I'm not upset at all by that. He doesn't really need to talk to me, but I'm pretty sure the same goes for all the other crossbenchers as well. And he is their best salesman. Now, if the key issue is crossbench support and not, you know, some international conference or whatever, their best salesman ought to be on the case.
David Leyonhjelm, we're out of time, but it sounds like, and you were a participant in it previously, we're going to have to organise another one of these crossbench roundtables here on Australian Agenda and maybe flesh this out in a little bit more detail. It sounds like there is a bit of a bottleneck going on there in the Senate, perhaps courtesy of the issues within the government, perhaps something that can be talked out here live on television. We appreciate you joining us on the program. Thanks very much for your company.
My pleasure.
Paul Kelly, as always, thanks for your company, and a reminder that this time next Sunday we will have, and he'll have been sworn in by then, the new Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce.